The twin moons of Zeta Prime loomed like silent sentinels in the sky, their cold light reflecting off the jagged, obsidian-black mountains that tore through the planet's surface like the fangs of some ancient beast. The land was restless, shifting beneath the weight of an unrelenting storm that never truly ceased. Above, the sky crackled with veins of electric fury, unstable, raw energy arcing across thick, storm-laden clouds. Below, the terrain pulsed with an eerie glow, as if the planet itself was alive, breathing through the violent fluctuations of magnetic currents that twisted through the air. The ground was a wasteland of tortured metal and rock, where massive fissures split open to reveal rivers of liquid silver, a substance neither molten nor solid, shifting like a thing caught between two states of being. The very atmosphere hummed with an energy that made the skin prickle, an omnipresent reminder that Zeta Prime was not meant for the weak. Nothing about this world was natural. The trees, if they could be called that, were grotesque structures of metallic tendrils, their silver branches twisting unnaturally, moving with the planet's unseen rhythms rather than the wind. Their roots pulsed, feeding not from soil or water, but from the crackling static that laced the air. Every so often, one would let out a shrill, mechanical screech, as if screaming in agony before shifting position once more. The land was inhospitable, but something else made it truly dangerous. In the shadows of the jagged ridges, something watched. Something moved. The Dravari. Predators. Stalkers. The true rulers of Zeta Prime. For centuries, the Dravari had hunted these lands, their golden eyes glowing like burning coals in the darkness. They did not simply defend their territory. They eliminated trespassers with the precision of apex hunters. Their warfare was not about conquest, nor about diplomacy. To them, survival was the only law, and those who violated their domain met one fate: death. High above the unstable terrain, a small, sleek craft sliced through the upper atmosphere, its black hull barely visible against the swirling storm. Inside, Captain Kael Rourke sat motionless, staring at the surface below. His visor displayed lines of data: radiation levels, atmospheric density, energy fluctuations, all confirming what he already knew. This mission was a mistake. He exhaled slowly, running a gloved hand over his helmet before securing it into place. The armor was standard issue for the Human Defense Force, HDF. A reinforced exosuit with an integrated thruster pack, designed for combat drops into hostile environments. The plating, tinted a deep gunmetal, flickered with the reddish glow of the planet's charged atmosphere, making him look almost spectral, a ghost about to descend into the unknown. Reconnaissance. That was the official objective. Find the source of the anomalous energy readings. Report back. No direct engagement. But Kael had been in this game too long to believe in simple missions. Zeta Prime had been a deadlock in the war between humanity and the Dravari for over a decade. Neither side could claim full control, and every attempt to establish a foothold had ended in disaster. And now, suddenly, High Command was interested in unusual activity on the surface. This wasn't a simple recon mission. This was something else. He shifted his gaze to the tactical overlay. His team was already on the ground, their vitals stable, moving through the rocky terrain in tight formation. 7 elite soldiers, trained for high-risk insertions, for worst-case scenarios. But training only accounted for so much. The Dravari didn't play by human rules. He had seen what they could do, watched from the safety of gunships as entire squads were ripped apart before they could fire a single shot. Speed. Precision. A level of lethality that no human soldier could match. He clenched his jaw. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of something far worse. The endless cycle. The war that never truly moved forward. Battles fought over barren worlds. Soldiers thrown into conflicts neither side could ever truly win. His father had fought in these wars. His grandfather before him. And what had it led to? Blood spilled on alien soil. Names carved into forgotten memorials. Was this his fate too? Kael's hand hovered over the drop controls. The ship's onboard AI pulsed a quiet warning. Winds reaching dangerous speeds, static discharge building in the clouds. The planet itself resisted their presence, as if rejecting them like an invading virus. He smirked bitterly. Figures. He engaged the descent sequence. The rear hatch hissed open, and the storm's fury rushed in, battering against his armor. The HUD flickered momentarily, recalibrating for the volatile atmosphere. Below, the land stretched out like the broken spine of a great beast, waiting to consume whatever dared set foot upon it. Kael took a breath. There are places in this galaxy where humans don't belong. The thrusters flared to life, and he leapt from the ship, plummeting toward the abyss. But orders are orders. The storm swallowed him whole. The crystalline forest shimmered under the eerie glow of Zeta Prime's twin moons, its metallic trees humming softly with each shift in the planet's unstable energy fields. Every step Kael Rourke and his team took sent faint ripples of light coursing through the strange silver branches, as though the trees themselves were reacting to their presence. Despite the beauty, a heavy tension clung to the air. The storm that had raged above for hours had quieted, but this silence was worse. It wasn't the calm before battle. It was the moment before the predator strikes. Kael's fingers tightened around his weapon as he scanned the shifting shadows ahead. His HUD displayed no immediate threats, but instincts honed by years in combat screamed otherwise. He had learned long ago that technology could fail. Instincts rarely did. He motioned for his squad to spread out. 7 highly trained operatives, their movements silent, their weapons primed. Even so, an unease rippled through them. They weren't afraid of a firefight, no. Fear was something they had been trained to purge. But this was different. There was no enemy to see, no clear battlefield to control. Then, it happened. The forest came alive with a sound that was not wind, nor the hum of energy coursing through its metallic veins. It was a low, guttural growl, reverberating through the trees like a phantom stalking its prey. Kael barely had time to react before the darkness moved. A blur of motion, a shadow breaking free from the obsidian rocks. It moved impossibly fast, weaving between the silvered trunks with the grace of a creature born to hunt in this terrain. Gunfire erupted, but it was already too late. The first soldier fell before he could scream. His body jerked back as something tore through his throat in a flash of silver. The second collapsed a heartbeat later, blood pooling around him before his body hit the ground. Then, silence. Kael's pulse thundered in his ears as his squad adjusted formation, but the damage had been done. 2 men down. His HUD flickered, trying to register the threat. And then he saw her. She emerged from the shadows like a specter, stepping into the fractured light of the crystal canopy above. The glow of the twin moons reflected in her golden eyes, sharp and burning with something ancient and merciless. Her armor was sleek obsidian, contoured to her form like the carapace of a midnight predator. Silver etchings shimmered along its surface, glowing faintly in the storm's lingering energy. Her black hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, swaying slightly with each measured step. Seraphina Kaeloris. Kael had never seen a Dravari up close before. Few humans had and lived to tell about it. He had read the reports, studied the battle footage, but none of it had prepared him for the sheer presence of her. She did not move like a soldier. She moved like a force of nature. When she finally spoke, it was barely more than a whisper, yet it carried with it the weight of something absolute. Humans. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze locked onto him. You don't belong here. Kael exhaled, steadying his weapon. We've heard that before. A ghost of a smile flickered across her lips, though it held no warmth. You never listen. She moved. No warning, no hesitation. 1 second she was standing before him, the next she was a blur of motion. Kael barely had time to react before she was on him. The impact was like being hit by a shockwave. His enhanced reflexes barely registered it before his back slammed against the nearest crystal trunk. His suit absorbed most of the force, but she was already moving again, faster than anything he'd ever encountered. She wasn't trying to kill him. Not yet. She was testing him. Kael twisted, using the momentum of the impact to throw his weight sideways, forcing separation between them. He brought his rifle up, but she was already gone, darting behind him like a phantom. A whisper of air, the gleam of silver claws. She struck. Kael blocked with his forearm, his armor taking the brunt of the attack, but the sheer force behind it sent him skidding backward. She was toying with him. His grip tightened around his weapon. Enough of this. He pivoted, shifting his stance, and launched himself forward. This time, he attacked first. A calculated strike, quick, controlled, aiming for center mass. But she was faster. She twisted around his assault with an effortless grace that sent a cold shiver down his spine. His weapon was useless against something that could move like this. She closed the distance. And then Kael felt it. Sharp, searing pain at the base of his neck. Her fangs. It took a moment for him to realize what had happened. A Dravari bite was a death sentence. Their venom was legendary, capable of shutting down the nervous system in seconds. He had seen soldiers collapse before they could even register the pain. He braced himself for the paralysis, the rapid deterioration, the darkness. But it didn't come. Seconds passed. The burning pain faded, but his limbs remained steady. His vision stayed sharp. He didn't fall. Seraphina jerked back, her eyes widening in something he had not expected to see from a Dravari warrior. Shock. Kael reached up, fingers brushing against the wound on his neck. Warm blood smeared his glove, but beyond the punctures, he felt fine. More than fine. The venom wasn't working. He met her gaze, something unspoken crackling in the space between them. She took a step back, her breathing uneven. It wasn't fear that filled her expression. It was something far worse. Confusion. She had killed before. Countless times. She knew exactly what should have happened. Kael should be on the ground, choking on his own breath. But here he was. Alive. Her golden eyes flickered, searching his face for an answer that neither of them had. How? Her voice was barely a whisper, the first sign of uncertainty breaking through her warrior's composure. Kael smirked, despite the situation. I was hoping you could tell me. The wind howled through the crystalline trees, carrying with it the tension of something unspoken. The planet itself seemed to hold its breath. The impossible had just happened, and both of them knew nothing would ever be the same again. The moment hung between them, thick with disbelief, and something neither of them dared name. The impossible had happened. Kael Rourke still stood, blood trailing down his neck where Sarah's fangs had torn into him. And yet, he was alive. Not just alive, but steady. Unaffected by the venom that should have stopped his heart. Sarah took another step back, her golden eyes narrowing, as though expecting him to suddenly collapse, for the poison to belatedly take hold. But nothing happened. The storm raged overhead, lightning splitting the sky in jagged veins of white-hot energy. But in this clearing, in the eerie stillness of the crystalline forest, Kael was an anomaly that neither of them could explain. There was no time to dwell on it. A low vibration trembled through the ground beneath them, faint at first, but rising into something unmistakable, the deep, rhythmic pulse of approaching aircraft. Kael barely had time to react before his helmet's HUD flickered with an incoming transmission. Distorted voices crackled through the comms, but the message was clear. HDF had found him. Damn it. The stealth shielding on his squad's dropship should have kept them off enemy scans, but something had tipped them off. Maybe it was the firefight. Maybe it was the anomaly his body had just proven itself to be. Either way, they weren't here for a rescue mission. They were here for him. Sarah stiffened as another sound joined the hum of engines. A sharp, high-frequency clicking from the depths of the forest. Kael didn't need a translator to know what it meant. The Dravari weren't far behind. 2 sides, 1 prize. And neither would let him walk away. Sarah's head snapped up, realization dawning on her as she assessed the situation. Her kind did not tolerate failure, and she had just failed to kill the enemy standing before her. Worse, she had unearthed something that should not exist. If the Dravari learned of Kael's immunity, they would never stop hunting him. but she wasn't about to help him. "I will not fight alongside you," she spat, claws flexing as she lowered herself into a defensive stance. "I would rather die than—" "Yeah, well," Kael interrupted, barely sparing her a glance as he pivoted, scanning their surroundings. "That makes two of us." Then he ran. Sarah snarled but didn't hesitate. She could hear them now, the swift, calculated movements of Dravari warriors weaving through the trees, closing in like a pack of predators. The HDF dropships weren't far either, their engines growing louder, the rumbling bass shaking the ground beneath them. Kael wasn't her ally, he wasn't even worth saving, but he was running in the right direction, away from both threats. With a growl of frustration, she followed. The trees blurred past as they sprinted, the metallic branches shifting and bending in response to the storm's fluctuating energy. Kael could hear the telltale whine of targeting systems locking onto them, the distant hiss of projectiles tearing through the air. Then the first explosion hit. The ground heaved, sending him stumbling forward as fire erupted in his periphery. A second blast followed, searing heat licking at his back as he rolled into cover behind a jagged outcrop of black stone. Sarah was already moving, her Dravari reflexes carrying her through the chaos with an almost unnatural fluidity. She twisted midair, avoiding the cascade of debris as another blast rocked the clearing behind them. No way HDF was trying to take him alive now. They weren't here to extract. They were here to neutralize. Kael clenched his jaw. Command wasn't about to let an anomaly like him fall into enemy hands, and if they couldn't bring him back, they'd make damn sure no one else did either. Sarah landed beside him, eyes burning with fury. "Your people are trying to kill you," she growled. "Yeah, I noticed," Kael muttered. More figures moved in the distance, Dravari closing in from the east, HDF operatives deploying from the ships above. They were surrounded. Options. He needed options. His squad was gone, lost in the initial ambush. His evac route was compromised. His comms were likely being jammed, which meant calling for backup was useless. That left one choice. He turned to Sarah. "I can get us out of here," he said. "But we do it my way." Sarah bared her fangs. "You assume I would ever run with a human?" He smirked. "I assume you like living." The hesitation lasted less than a second. The Dravari were proud, but they weren't stupid. Sarah could see the odds as clearly as he could. Without another word, she launched herself forward, moving faster than Kael could track. He didn't need to be told to follow. They darted through the burning wreckage of the battlefield, weaving between bursts of gunfire and the relentless pursuit of both factions. The Dravari were faster, but the HDF had firepower, and the air was thick with the scent of scorched earth and blood. Somewhere in the chaos, Kael spotted an opening, a gap in the rocky terrain leading down into the canyon below. It was risky, steep, unpredictable. But it was a hell of a lot better than standing their ground and waiting to get shot. He grabbed Sarah's wrist, more force of instinct than strategy, and yanked her toward the ledge. She snarled, nearly tearing his arm off in response, but the realization of what he was doing registered in her eyes just as the ground beneath them erupted. They fell. The wind roared past as they plunged into darkness, the battle above disappearing in a blur of fire and smoke. Then they hit the ground, rolling hard against the rocky riverbed below. Kyle's breath left him in a sharp exhale, pain blooming along his ribs. Beside him, Sarah groaned, but she was already pushing herself upright, shaking off the impact. Silence. For the first time in what felt like hours, there were no gunshots, no roars of warships. They were alone. Kael dragged himself to his feet, swiping blood from his brow. That could have gone worse. Sarah shot him a withering glare. "You are insufferable." He grinned. "I get that a lot." She exhaled sharply, turning her attention back to the towering canyon walls around them. Climbing back up wasn't an option. That left one choice: moving forward. Together. Sarah bristled at the thought. Kael was still the enemy, a trespasser. And yet, she had tried to kill him, and failed. The Dravari did not fail. Something about him wasn't right. And until she figured out what that was, she wasn't about to let him out of her sight. Kael dusted himself off and took a step forward. Then another. Sarah fell into stride beside him, the tension between them thick as the storm clouds still churning overhead. Neither trusted the other, neither had a choice. But for now, survival was the only thing that mattered. The canyon walls loomed high above them, jagged and unforgiving, their surfaces etched with the scars of storms that never truly ceased. The ground beneath Kael's boots was uneven, shifting between solid rock and treacherous layers of crystalline dust that crackled softly with latent energy. He adjusted his grip on his rifle, though it did little to ease the tension coiling in his muscles. The silence was unnatural, thick and oppressive, pressing against his ears like a tangible force. Sarah moved ahead of him, silent as a shadow, her golden eyes flickering in the dim glow of Zeta Prime's twin moons. She didn't glance back, didn't offer him any direction. She didn't need to. Kael had no choice but to follow. He could still hear the distant echoes of battle above, but the warships had stopped searching for them, for now. That meant one thing. They were officially considered dead. Kael exhaled sharply, shaking off the thought. Maybe that was a good thing. It gave them time. Time to figure out what the hell was happening. Time to figure out what he had become. Ahead, the terrain began to shift. The jagged walls of the canyon gradually gave way to something far stranger. Wisps of pale blue mist curled around their feet, drifting lazily through the air like living things. The further they walked, the thicker it became, swirling in luminous tendrils that pulsed softly, reacting to their movements. Kael slowed his pace. Something about this wasn't right. Sarah stopped as well, muscles tensing as she raised a hand. "Don't move," she murmured. The mist trembled as if alive, stretching toward them in slow, curious waves. Kael had seen many strange things in his time as a soldier, worlds that defied logic, creatures that seemed born from nightmares. But this was different. It wasn't just unnatural. It was watching them. "What the hell is this?" Kael muttered. Sarah's gaze didn't waver. "The Veil of Storms." Kael frowned. He had heard the name before, buried in the classified reports about Zeta Prime's uncharted territories. Few had crossed into it, and none had returned. "That's comforting," he muttered. Sarah ignored him, crouching to touch the ground. Her claws barely skimmed the surface before the mist recoiled violently, as though repelled by her presence. "It's alive," she said quietly. "Or something close to it." Kael watched as the mist settled again, curling protectively around the rocks. "And it doesn't like you," he noted. Sarah's lips curled in irritation. "That makes two of us." Before he could reply, a low hum rippled through the air, deep and resonant. Kael felt it in his bones more than he heard it, a vibration that thrummed through the soles of his boots and up into his skull. Then, movement. Shapes stirred in the mist, flickering between visibility and nothingness. They weren't solid, not entirely, but their presence was unmistakable. Predators. Kael barely had time to raise his weapon before one of them lunged. A blur of motion, a flicker of shifting light, then impact. Kael was thrown backward, rolling across the uneven ground as the creature slammed into him. It wasn't made of flesh, not in the way he understood. It moved like liquid but hit like solid steel, wrapping around his limbs with tendrils of pure energy. Sarah was already moving, her blade slicing through the air. The creature screeched, a sound that made Kael's vision blur, vibrating in ways his mind couldn't process. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished back into the mist. Kael forced himself to his feet, chest heaving. "What the hell was that?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. Her gaze was fixed on the mist, her body taut with tension. "They hunt using brainwaves," she said finally. "They don't see. They sense. Emotions. Fear. Thought." Kael swore under his breath. "Great. So how do we get through this without getting ripped apart?" Sarah hesitated. "We don't think." Kael stared at her. "You want me to not think?" Her jaw clenched. "You need to quiet your mind. Focus on nothing. They can't latch on to what they can't detect." It was ridiculous. Impossible. But the alternative was worse. Kael exhaled slowly, forcing his breath to steady. It was counterintuitive. Every instinct screamed at him to stay alert, to track every movement. but he shut his eyes anyway. He pushed everything else away. The war, the uncertainty, the thing he had become. He thought of silence, and the mist pulled back. They moved forward cautiously, every step slow, deliberate. The creatures lingered at the edges of their awareness, but they did not attack. By the time they reached the other side of the veil, Kael's body was slick with sweat. His hands trembled, though whether from exhaustion or the sheer unnatural experience, he wasn't sure. Then the pain hit. White-hot agony lanced through his side, stealing his breath. Kael stumbled, catching himself against the nearest rock. Sarah's eyes snapped to him immediately. "You're injured." Kael gritted his teeth. "Hadn't noticed." Sarah stepped closer, eyes narrowing. She didn't need to ask. She had seen it happen. When the creature had hit him, one of its tendrils had lashed across his torso. The wound was deep, jagged, pulsing with something that wasn't just blood. Kael pressed a hand to his side, fingers coming away slick and dark. "It's fine. I just need—" "You need treatment." Kael shook his head, but before he could protest further, Sarah grabbed him by the collar and shoved him against the rock. He barely had time to react before she pressed her palm to the wound. A jolt of searing heat spread through his body, sharp and unbearable. Kael gasped, every muscle locking in place as something crawled beneath his skin. He could feel it, whatever the creature had left behind, squirming, spreading. Then, suddenly, it was gone. The pain ebbed. The burning stopped. Kael exhaled sharply, blinking up at Sarah. "What the hell did you just do?" Her gaze was unreadable. "Dravari biology is designed to adapt," she said simply. "We heal differently than humans." Kael stared at her. "You healed me." Sarah didn't answer immediately. "I removed the infection." It wasn't the same thing, but Kael knew the truth. For the first time since they had met, she had chosen to save him, not as an asset, not as a prisoner, as something else. He wasn't sure what to say to that. Sarah stood, turning away before he could see whatever emotion flickered across her face. "We need to keep moving." Kael pushed himself upright, testing his side. The pain was gone. Completely. He looked at her again. Really looked at her. And for the first time, he didn't see her as a monster. Just as she, perhaps, no longer saw him as one. Neither of them spoke as they left the Veil of Storms behind. But something had changed. The ruins stretched before them, ancient and broken, swallowed by the relentless passage of time. The jagged remains of what had once been an imposing structure jutted from the scorched earth, like the ribs of some long-dead beast, half buried in dust and silence. The air was thick with the weight of something long forgotten, something waiting to be unearthed. Kael's boots crunched against shattered stone as he moved through the debris, his every step sending echoes through the hollow remnants of history. The storm that had chased them for days had finally quieted, but an unnatural stillness lingered in its wake, thick and expectant. Sarah walked ahead of him, her movements deliberate, golden eyes scanning the ruins with a wariness that mirrored his own. Her presence had changed since the Veil of Storms. There was less hostility in the way she carried herself around him now, but that didn't mean she trusted him. Not fully. Not yet. Neither did Kael. He still wasn't sure what he was becoming. The wound from his encounter with the creatures of the Veil had healed too quickly, the memory of its pain already fading from his mind. The sensation of Sarah's healing touch still lingered beneath his skin, foreign, yet oddly familiar. There was no denying that he had survived things no human should have, that he had walked away from her venom, from the dangers of Zeta Prime itself, when no one else would have. Something was wrong with him, and he had a feeling the answers lay within these ruins. Sarah stopped abruptly at the base of a crumbling staircase, her gaze fixed on an entryway half buried beneath the weight of fallen rock. Strange symbols, worn by time, were etched into the stone above it, pulsing faintly with residual energy. "This isn't human," Kael murmured, stepping closer. Sarah traced her fingers over the carvings, her expression unreadable. "It isn't Dravari either." That sent a chill through him. Before he could respond, she pressed her palm against the wall. The air hummed. The ground trembled. Then, with a deep guttural groan, the stone gave way. A narrow passageway yawned open before them, a tunnel descending into darkness. Sarah turned to him, her expression unreadable in the dim glow of the ruins. "This place has been hidden for a long time," she said. "If it was meant to stay that way, there's a reason." Kael exhaled. "Then let's find out what they were trying to hide." They stepped inside. The walls of the corridor pulsed faintly, veins of some unknown material running beneath the surface like circuitry woven into the stone itself. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became, pressing against their lungs with an almost tangible force. Then, at the end of the corridor, they found it. A door. Massive, circular, adorned with the same symbols that had marked the entrance above. It hissed open at their approach, and beyond it lay a laboratory untouched by time. Kael took a slow step forward, his heart pounding against his ribs. The room was vast, lined with rows of containment units, their glass cracked and clouded with age. Strange machinery, unlike anything he had ever seen, hummed softly, still active despite the centuries that had passed. The air smelled of metal and dust, of forgotten science and buried secrets. He approached one of the containment units, wiping a layer of grime from the surface. What lay inside made his breath catch. A skeleton. But not human. Not entirely. It was taller, its structure eerily similar to a Dravari, but with subtle differences, its bone structure finer, its form slightly less predatory. His gaze flickered to the others. More skeletons. More hybrids. The realization settled over him like ice. This wasn't just a ruin. It was a graveyard. Sarah moved beside him, her golden eyes scanning the remains with something close to disbelief. This isn't possible." Kael turned to her. "What the hell is this place?" She didn't answer. Instead, she moved toward a console at the center of the room, its surface flickering weakly to life as she pressed her palm against it. The walls shuddered. Then, with a sharp crackle, a holographic projection flickered into existence before them. A figure stood within the light, a being unlike anything Kael had ever seen. Not fully human, not fully Dravari. A hybrid. It began to speak, its voice distorted by time, its language something old, something forgotten. The translation flickered across Kael's visor. "If you are seeing this, the experiment has failed. We were wrong." Kael's throat tightened. The projection continued. "Our species, once one, now divided. We sought to bridge the divide, to undo the breaking." Sarah stiffened. No. Kael barely heard her. He was staring at the figure, at the way its features shifted, flickering between something familiar and something alien. His pulse pounded. Then came the final words. "But evolution is not so easily controlled. It chooses its own path. And now, so must you." The hologram flickered and died. Silence. Kael turned to Sarah. Her expression was unreadable, but he could see the way her hands trembled, the way her claws flexed against her palms. "They lied to us," she whispered. Kael could barely form words. "Who?" Sarah turned, her eyes burning. "All of them." The truth settled between them, vast and undeniable. Humans and Dravari were not separate. They had once been one, and whatever had torn them apart had been orchestrated. Kael took an unsteady breath, his mind reeling. "That's why I survived, isn't it?" Sarah didn't answer. She didn't need to. Because he already knew. He wasn't immune to Dravari venom. He was a part of it. And now, everything was about to change. A sharp silence followed the flickering death of the hologram. Kael could still hear the echo of those final words in his head. "Evolution chooses its own path. And now, so must you." His breath was shallow. His pulse pounded. Everything he had believed about himself, about the war, about the line that divided his people and Sarah's, It had all just shattered into something unrecognizable. Sarah stood rigid beside him, golden eyes locked onto the skeletal remains within the containment pods. Her claws curled inward, gripping air like she was ready to tear through flesh, to break something, anything. Neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say. They knew the truth now. They were the same. Kael swallowed hard and turned toward her. "We have to get out of here. Now." Sarah didn't move, didn't blink. This was never supposed to be found. Her voice was barely a whisper. Kael stepped closer. "Yeah, well, someone really screwed up trying to bury it." Sarah's lips parted like she wanted to argue, to refute what they had just witnessed. But before she could respond, the ground trembled beneath them. Kael instinctively reached for his weapon as the entire facility let out a deep, mechanical groan. Lights flickered. The walls shook. Then came the alarm. A deep, pulsing siren, reverberating through the ruined laboratory, its sound vibrating against Kael's ribs like the warning call of a dying beast. They had been detected. "That's bad, right?" Kael muttered, already moving toward the exit. Sarah didn't answer. She was ahead of him now, sprinting through the passageway they had come from, her instincts screaming louder than any alarm could. Kael was right behind her. They raced up the winding tunnels, their breath ragged, boots hammering against stone. The pulse of the alarm followed them, the rhythmic sound growing louder, more urgent. Then, as they reached the final stretch of the exit, Kael's HUD flared red. A warning. Multiple incoming heat signatures. Sarah stopped so fast that Kael almost collided into her. A moment later, the sky erupted. The ruined entrance of the facility exploded inward, sending chunks of stone and metal flying. The shockwave knocked Kael off balance, his ears ringing from the impact. Then came the roar of engines. Kael lifted his head, blinking through the dust, and saw them. HDF warships, and just beyond them, Dravari hunters. Both factions had arrived at the same time. Captured. The fight didn't last long. Kael had no time to reach for his rifle before the exosuited HDF soldiers were on him, pinning him to the ground with brutal efficiency. Sarah fought. Of course she did. Kael saw her out of the corner of his eye, a blur of lethal motion, claws slashing, bones snapping. A human soldier went down. Then another. But it wasn't enough. A heavy impact struck the side of her head, stunning her for just a second. But a second was all it took. The moment her body hit the ground, the Dravari warriors descended upon her, shackling her with restraints forged from their strongest alloys. Kael felt rage burn through him at the sight of her forced to her knees, but his own captors yanked him forward, dragging him toward a waiting transport. The interrogation. Kael sat motionless in the cold metal chair, his wrists bound behind him. The interrogation chamber was sterile, featureless, built for extraction rather than diplomacy. Across from him, Colonel Marcus Strain watched with calculated interest. "So, let's talk," Strain said, voice smooth as polished steel. "You survived a Dravari Venom strike. You should be dead, but you're not. And now I find out you're some kind of genetic anomaly? Care to explain that to me?" Kael's jaw clenched. He knew the look in Strain's eyes. It wasn't curiosity. It was ownership. "You don't want answers," Kael muttered. "You want leverage." Strain tilted his head. "Clever. You always were." Kael exhaled sharply through his nose. "You're thinking about it, aren't you? If I survived a Dravari Venom bite, if I can heal faster, adapt, then maybe we can replicate it," Strain finished smoothly. There it was. HDF hadn't come to rescue him. They had come to weaponize him. Kael swallowed the bile rising in his throat. "You want to turn me into a biological weapon." Strain leaned forward. "I want to end a war, Captain. A war we've been losing for decades. The Dravari outmatch us in strength, in speed, in sheer brutality. But you—" His eyes gleamed. "You could be the key." Kael felt sick. "And what? You'll inject my DNA into every soldier on Earth? Turn humanity into something else entirely?" Strain shrugged. Sacrifices must be made for survival. A bitter laugh escaped Kael's lips. Yeah, that's the same thing the Dravari are saying about me right now. Strain's expression darkened. Speaking of which, he murmured, tapping a control panel. The reinforced doors slid open. 2 figures stepped inside, Dravari warriors, and between them, shackled, golden eyes blazing with defiance, Sera. She had been beaten, but her expression was fierce, unbroken. Kael's pulse pounded. He saw the way Strain watched her, the same cold assessment he had given Kael. They want to kill you, Strain told him, as if Kael needed reminding. They want to erase everything you represent, but we... He gestured vaguely toward the HDF insignia on his uniform. We want to give you purpose. Kael met Sera's gaze across the room. She understood. Neither side would ever accept them. Neither side wanted the truth to exist. This war had been built on a lie, and now that lie was collapsing. So Kael made a choice. A choice he never thought he'd make. He turned to Strain. You're right about one thing, he said, voice deadly calm. I am different. But not because of what you think, Strain frowned. What are you talking about? Kael inhaled slowly. That war you want to end. The one you think you can win? His gaze flickered to Sera, then back to Strain. You're fighting the wrong enemy. Then, before anyone could react, Kael moved. He had spent years following orders, choosing sides, believing the fight had only 2 paths. Now he was forging a third. And for the first time in his life, Sera was right there beside him. The air was thick with smoke, the metallic scent of blood and burning fuel lingering long after the battle had ended. Sparks crackled from ruined consoles, and overhead, warning lights flashed in a dying rhythm. Kael exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the stolen Dravari shuttle's control panel, his body still humming with adrenaline. The cuts and bruises he'd accumulated in the fight were nothing compared to the weight settling on his chest. They had escaped. Against all odds, against 2 warring factions hell-bent on destroying them, they had survived. But where the hell could they go now? Sera sat opposite him, silent, her golden eyes flickering with something he couldn't quite name. She had been quiet ever since they had blasted out of the HDF outpost, leaving chaos in their wake. The blood on her armor had started to dry, but the tension in her shoulders remained taut, like a wire pulled too tight. For the first time in his life, Kael Rourke had no orders, no command structure, no allegiance. Neither did she. That should have made things easier. It didn't. The control panel in front of him flickered weakly, struggling to process the data feed from the ship's damaged systems. Their stolen vessel was barely holding together, but it had gotten them out. That was all that mattered, for now. Sera finally spoke, her voice low. They will hunt us. Kael let out a breathless chuckle. Yeah, I kind of figured. Sera turned toward him, studying him with that same unreadable intensity. You don't understand, she said, her claws tapping lightly against the armrest. They will never stop. Kael held her gaze. Neither will we. A muscle in her jaw tensed, but she didn't argue. Instead, she glanced out the viewport, where the swirling abyss of deep space stretched infinitely before them. No home. No safe harbor. So what now? She asked. Kael leaned back against the pilot's chair, tilting his head toward the shattered remains of his past. There was no going back to HDF. To them, he was a rogue soldier, an experiment gone wrong, a biological anomaly that needed to be controlled, or eliminated. The Dravari Council wouldn't accept him either. He was living proof of a truth they had spent centuries denying. They would rather kill him and silence the past than acknowledge what he was. The war would not stop for them. But maybe, just maybe, they could stop the war. Kael turned his gaze back to Sera. We find the truth. She narrowed her eyes slightly. You think there's more? Kael nodded. That lab wasn't the beginning. It was the middle of something bigger. Someone buried the truth about our species, who we were before the war, Before all of this, he gestured toward the stars outside. I want to know why. Sarah considered this, her golden eyes reflecting the dim glow of the failing console. You believe knowing the past will change the present? Kael smirked. It's better than running forever. Silence stretched between them, but this time, it was different. Not tension, not distrust, understanding. Sarah let out a slow breath, the faintest trace of a smirk touching her lips. Then we find the truth. Kael nodded once, then turned his attention back to the controls, his fingers gliding over the ancient interface. The ship's navigation systems were damaged, but the database was still intact. Coordinates, fragments of old star maps, unknown locations marked as classified, places long forgotten. One in particular stood out, a signal buried deep in the system, broadcasting from the farthest edge of the galaxy. A beacon. Kael's pulse quickened. He turned to Sarah, tapping the display. This is our best lead. She leaned forward, studying the encrypted data. A distress signal? Kael frowned. No. It's older. This isn't someone calling for help. This is someone who wanted to be found. A new kind of tension filled the space between them. Sarah slowly leaned back in her seat, her fingers curling against the armrests. Then let's find them. Kael set the coordinates. The engines whined in protest, struggling against the damage they had sustained. But as the ship rumbled to life, the stars outside began to bend. A jump. A leap into the unknown. They weren't soldiers anymore. They weren't enemies. They were something else entirely. And in the vast darkness of the galaxy, unseen eyes watched as their stolen vessel slipped into hyperspace. Waiting. Hunting. The past wasn't the only thing stirring. Something was coming. Something far older than the war. Far deadlier. And Kael and Sarah had just stepped into its shadow. Their story wasn't over. It was only the beginning. Across the galaxies, across time itself. You've found your way here. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Let's see how far across the universe our community reaches. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because tomorrow's episode will take you even deeper into the unknown. You won't want to miss it.